Welcome on in, golf fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our DFS and betting preview for this week's RBC Heritage. We've got a signature event, an absolutely stacked field, and a golf course that might be a little bit quirky, but one that really requires a precise skill set. It's not that bomb and gouge strategy that you'll see at some of these tour events, and a nice refreshing change when it comes to the skill set that is required. So I'm going to break down everything you need to know about this week, including my key stats and modeling, the types of metrics I'm looking at to identify my top plays, and then afterwards, what most of you are here for, how I'm attacking the DFS and betting board. We'll talk through some of my top targets, both for outright bets and for some DFS exposure, to give you an idea of the types of players, the type of skill set that I'm looking for this week to go out there and get my exposure. So a lot to talk about here. Let's start it off with the golf course and how I'm expecting Harbour golf links to play. As I mentioned off the bat, this is not a bomber's paradise. In fact, there's only about 5-6 holes where you can really even hit driver. So an elite tier power player like a Rory, Wyndham, Clark aren't going to get that same sort of advantage at this kind of venue. On top of that, you have a lot of longer irons because of all the layups off the tee, and because it is such a demanding course when it comes to that precision, you're going to see a lot of players hitting irons off the tee around here. So only 7,200 yards, but plays a lot longer from the iron perspective. So when we take a look at the approach profile, you'd be surprised to see that this 175 to 200 yard range is by far the highest utilized. In fact, it is about 30% of your iron shots that are coming from that 25 yard margin. So if there's anything to emphasize more, I'd say it is that 175 to 200. Maybe if you are an elite tier player that's more aggressive, you'll have slightly more shots, right, from 150 to 175. But because of the setup of the golf course, all the forced layups, there's not much you can do to reduce that number. So power is still going to be useful, especially for hitting shorter clubs off the tee, also into greens on the par 3s, even par 4s, where you're having to lay up, but it's not the same sort of effect we get at some of the other signature events. In terms of off the tee, because of that, right, de-emphasizing driving distance, so in fact, it is hardly even included in my modeling this week, and much more looking at driving accuracy stats, like just regular driving accuracy, and of course, distance from the center of fairway. Because of all the overhanging limbs at this golf course, even when you're in the short stuff, oftentimes you'll be blocked out to the green or have to hit some sort of fade or draw into the pin location, and the only way to avoid that is to be a hyper accurate player that's not only hitting the short stuff but hitting the center of the fairway. So by taking a look at this advanced metric, we can try and take a look at the players that not only hit the short stuff but are hyper accurate doing so. And a few players that come to mind there would be a Colin Morikawa, ranks towards the top of that list pretty much nonstop. Russell Henley, also players that are in there in that top 5, top 10 of driving accuracy. Almost all of them are at the top of this metric, but not all of them. So a way to parse through that data, right, try and take out some of that variance, is just to take a look at their distance from center of fairway. Also looking at around the green stats, it has been correlated to success over the last 5 years here. In fact, it is about twice as important at this golf course as compared to most courses out there on tour. So certainly something that I'm looking at for my analysis. Putting, de-emphasized. It is one of the easier putting courses that we get on the entire year. And in fact, 2 years ago, Jordan Spieth won this golf tournament despite losing strokes with the flat stick. So I wouldn't count on that every year. In fact, that is certainly still a fringe outcome. But if somebody can win the RBC Heritage by losing strokes putting, it's obviously not the end all be all. Course history is pretty sticky around here because of that particular skill set. So I think you should include that in your modeling. Birdie or better opportunities gain stats. That's a way to take a look at the players setting up the most birdie opportunities. So I like to take a look at that as well. And then for our comp courses, we've got the Wyndham Championship, FedEx St. Jude, and Pebble Beach Pro-Am that all feature extremely short golf courses, a lot of layups off the tee, and are much more about that precision with the irons, even some of the around the green play at these golf courses, than that power game and that putting. So again, I think pretty good comps that you can take a look at for some leaderboard crossover, and shots gained at these 3 venues are something that I'm including with all of my projections and modeling. So with that being said, now that we know what to expect from this golf course, what are the players that I'm looking for? And we're going to start with a few core plays that I've bet outright. Also, our value plays this week are guys that I've bet outright as well. So there's going to be 6 players that were taken to win this week, which is pretty atypical for me, right? Normally I try and keep it a little bit tighter for my exposure, but because of the wide range of players that can win here, because of the fact that it's not, that bomb and gouge signature event that we see for a lot of these big field events, I think a lot more players are live to win. So we're going to have a lot more outrights here, and we're going to start at the top of the board with our core plays. So my core play, of course, in DFS is a player that I'm getting well over the field on. So if somebody like Xander comes in at 25% ownership, which I think is pretty realistic this week, I might be taking him in half of my lineup. So these are some of the bigger stands that I'm going to be taking in DFS this week, and are players that were the first clicks for outrights on my end. So first off, with the X-Man, he is $10,800. I think that is a fair price tag considering that he's been the most consistent golfer not named Scottie Scheffler over the last month and a half, 2 months. In 2024, right, you take a look at the shots gained metrics, X-Man has been extremely consistent. So in terms of his shots gained categories, gaining across all 4 categories, if you zoom in a little bit more, take a look at the last 12 measured rounds, you'll see that it's even more impressive. He's gaining about a half a stroke per round or more in all 4 stat categories. And around a golf course where you can't do it with the power, right? It's not really a putting first sort of golf course. I want well-rounded players, or I want guys that don't have to lean into that elite tier off the tee play. And last year, it was the first time he had played it in a few years out there. He ended up finishing in 4th place, which is extremely impressive, right? In one of those signature event fields. Hadn't played it since 2020 before, and at least made the cut in his first 3 starts around Harbour Town. But now that he's playing much better golf, I would argue that his form lately is, again, the second most impressive form in the entire world. And Scottie Scheffler is going to be a play this week, particularly if he's lower owned. But we don't know if he's going to be lower owned, right? He might end up being like 20-25% in GPPs. And at a $13,000 price tag, it's not a given that he's going to be a smash play this week. So I know that Xander Schauffele is a player I'm going to get exposure to. I know that he's going to be chalky out there. It'll either be him or Aberg that is likely your highest owned player in the 10K range. And out of those two, I trust the skill set of Xander Schauffele, right? Ludwig Aberg gains a lot of his strokes with his off the tee by being long and straight. And though he can hit fairways when he hits the driver, it's not the kind of golf course where you can get away with that. It's a lot of dog legs. It's a lot of trees that are overhanging those dog legs. And it is literally impossible to hit driver on at least like 4 or 5 of those tee shots at the very least, if not closer to 5 or 6 of them. So Aberg is getting that taken away. Obviously, the second place finish at the Masters is going to do a lot for his ownership. And at 10-1 for an outright bet, I think this is a spot where Xander could go off, because even if we take a look at the recent form, right, I already took a look at the event history there. He's gone 8th, right, 5th at the Valspar, 2nd at the Players Championship. Players Championship was a really good week for Xander Schauffele, but he's yet to really look like he's fully under control. I mean, even last week at the Masters, where he ended up finishing in the top 10, his first round was really shaky. Even rounds 2 through 4, he didn't do anything special, yet despite that, still finished in the top 8. At the Valspar, same thing, really never had his best stuff, was out there just kind of, grinding it out, went way up the leaderboard out there on Sunday, yet still finished in the top 5. In Players Championship, he had all 4 facets of his game. He gained significantly in all 4 stat categories, and of course that resulted in a 2nd place. So I think sooner rather than later, you're going to see that good version of Xander come out, where he is going out there and doing a lot of damage with all 4 categories. And rather than resulting in a 2nd place finish, this is the sort of golf course where he fits it perfectly, right? He's well-rounded. He isn't reliant on one category or the other, and I think that's really good for what you're looking for at the RBC Heritage. So he's a player at 10-1 that I took. I think on Hard Rock Bet he actually drifted to 11-1. So if you can get that number, by all means, go out there and do so. I think he might even be 12-1 on a few sports books out there as well. But even at 10-1, just feels like a player that I think is due for a win. He's playing well enough to go out there and win a golf tournament. We're at a venue that fits his sort of skill set, and because he's been really good of late, but he hasn't been that sharp, imagine if he goes out there and has that spike performance. So I see a lot of the potential in an X-Man this week, and he's going to come with ownership. I'll tell you that right now. He's going to be extremely high owned this week. Just know that when you're building lineups, right? Pivot elsewhere in your other 5 spots by taking one chalky player that is not the end of your lineup, right? Somebody like Scottie last week was extremely high owned for main slate, and it didn't matter, right? He won by all those strokes. He scored well over 100 fantasy points, whereas the rest of the field was down there in that 80-point range. So sometimes the chalk is worth taking. Take them in one of your 6 spots and figure out a way to get different and get that leverage with your other 5 positions. Our next core play is going to be Tommy Fleetwood, and I got him at 20-1. I know he's drifted down a little bit over there at Hard Rock Bet, so not nearly the same number available now. But Tommy Fleetwood is a player that's looked a lot better over the last few weeks. And the main issue we had with Tommy Ladd, the reason why he was struggling to start 2024 was the approach play. He had been dreadful with the irons, had been losing over a stroke per round for a lot of this season, and now that he's gone back into it, right, last 2 weeks, he's gained over 3 strokes on approach in both golf tournaments. That is not reflected in his last 24 rounds, as the shots gained metrics from the Masters are not official. So, if you're modeling, if you're looking at a lot of databases, not all of them, some of them have brought in the unofficial stats, which is great. My system, where I get my shots gained metrics from, does not bring in the Masters stuff. Still says that he's losing 0.7 strokes per round. So people that aren't looking into the stats, that aren't including those Masters metrics, are probably going to get thrown off a little bit, right? So I know that the irons look a lot better than they do in reality. In fact, he should be gaining closer to 0.7 strokes per round if we adjust for those rounds at the Masters. And on top of that, has good course history here, right? Take a look at the last 5 years. Has gone T15, T10 his last 2 years. Did miss the cut 3 years ago, but another top 25 back there in 2019. On top of that, the recent form is, I think, a little bit misleading, right? Has gone 3rd last week, 7th the week before, so is playing much better golf than the shots gained metrics would tell you. Is a solid putter on this surface. You can see gains 0.35 strokes per round putting over there on this POA overseed. And Xander Schauffele, the same thing. You can see he's gaining 0.64 strokes per round. So 2 players that I think could regress positively with the flat stick this week, and that really fit this game, right? Tommy Fleetwood, not a bomber off the tee, certainly not short, but is not gaining all of his strokes in that category, is capable of contributing in all 4 stat categories. That's something that we see from Xander Schauffele, right? Again, not a player that relies on that power, and this is the kind of golf course where these players can win. So, of course, Tommy Ladd's still no PGA Tour wins, so always a little bit of a meme when you're betting somebody that's never done it before, but if there's a time and place for it to happen, it's at the RBC Heritage. It's the perfect kind of golf course for it. And I think the form is a lot better than people are giving him credit for. So in terms of ownership, I think that he's going to get some steam this week, but because of the $9,800 price tag, I don't think it's going to get out of hand. So because he's up there with Homa, who of course was up there in contention at the Masters, Matt Fitzpatrick, who won this last year playing really solid golf himself, even Colin Morikawa was in contention, Patrick Cantlay with his course history, I can't see Tommy Fleetwood being 15% or more owned. So I've got him in that 10 to 15% range right now. We'll have to see where he comes in on the Wednesday live strat, see exactly where his ownership's at. But if he's closer to 10% than he is 15%, is going to be a solid leverage play for some of the GPPs and a player that I think is capable of winning this event. And now for our last core play we're going to go through here is going to be Shane Lowry at $8,500. Still some value plays down towards the bottom of the board that we're going to go through. But in terms of players that I'm getting a lot of leverage to, Shane Lowry fits the mold here. And, he's not always the best off the tee player, but of late has been a lot better than what we're used to seeing for good old Shano. So you can see over his last 12 measured rounds, gaining about a half a stroke per round off the tee, over 1.3 strokes per round with the approach play. So has been one of, if not the best iron player in this field, not named Scotty Scheffler, and the short game has been stout. Now, it hasn't been great. That's why we haven't been seeing him win golf tournaments, but the ball striking stats, the tee to green stats in general, have been about as good as you could possibly want. We zoom out a little bit. It's not just a one-hit wonder. He's been doing this for the last 2 months at this stage. You can see he's still gaining off the tee, maybe not as significantly. Same thing out there with the approach play, but the short game has at least been serviceable over the last 24 measured rounds. So Shane Lowry doing a lot of the things we're looking for, and historically, right, not always the best off the tee player, but around the green with the approaches is maybe the best player in the field, and the putter can be a little bit hit or miss, right? If we take a look at his stats on POA this year, these shots gained POA overseed are just from 2024. You can see he's had a little bit of a rough go, right? Losing about 0.7 strokes per round, which is even worse than that 24 round baseline. So these greens, at least this type of grass in general, has not been very favorable to him this year. But if you take a look at his starts at this event in the past, and of course, the course history here is just immaculate. Last year, not so great with the T67, but went T3, T9, another T3 there 5 years ago, and he's been gaining a bunch of strokes putting. He's had a few years like last year where he lost about 2 strokes putting, but he's had strokes gained of over 3 to even 5 strokes on the flat stick over here at the RBC Heritage. So whether it's the green complexes that he's able to read better, maybe just likes the speed of these greens a little bit more than what he's used to seeing, Shane Lowry has had a lot of spike performances here, and if he continues that tee to green play, which has him as my top 5 model ranking this week, right down there at just $8,500, that could be a win, right? Even if he's just an average putter this week, right, is not bleeding 2-3 strokes in that category, that's a top 15, top 20 performance at worst. if not getting up there into the top 10. And at $8,500, that is borderline optimal right there. And then, of course, when you factor in the upside for him to have a spike week with the flat stick, you know, it makes him maybe my favorite play down here in the 8K range. So the ownership's going to be there. So Tommy Fleetwood, right, I think might be a leverage play. You're not going to get that with Xander, and you're certainly not going to get that with Shane Lowry. He is coming in with just too good a form for people to overlook him. In fact, I think he'll probably be in that 15 to 17.5% range when it comes to his ownership on Wednesday. So something that I'll be monitoring quite closely. But even if he is 20% owned, which I think would probably be towards the higher end of his ownership spectrum, if he's going to be 20%, I'll still take him in 35, maybe 40% of my lineups. But if he's getting closer to 22.5%, 25% ownership is probably where I'm out on a Shane Lowry. So certainly a player that I'll be splurging on when it comes to the ownership. So if I'm starting with a Xander and using a Shane Lowry, well, my last 4 spots are really going to have to get different, right? I'm going to need at least 3 leverage plays, at most 1 guy that's like average in terms of ownership. Because if you're taking 3, 4 chalky guys in a lineup is where you're starting to get into issues with leverage. So, of course, guys, when you're building lineups, it's not always who you're taking, it's how you're taking them in your lineup. So, game theory, that's going to be something that we talk about a lot on the Wednesday live stream. But when it's coming to some of these top end plays, this is not where I'm getting different, right? A lot of that's going to come down there in the 6 and 7K range where I'm looking to get that leverage. Before we hop into our value plays, a few long shots that I'm taking out there for outrights, make sure to check out my Patreon page if you haven't already. So you can see this little caption on here. That is where you can get access to all of these spreadsheets. So if you're looking for all my projections, modeling, ownership, you name it, all of that is posted on there on the Patreon version. You can download this sheet, use it for your own research, your own disposal. You can put it into your optimizer, get all of those projections updated, and on top of that, do all of your research. So I've got the recent form on here, event history, all the shots gained metrics that I mentioned, and over here on the key stats tab, I give you an exact idea of how to model this golf course. So, you know, not just giving you my modeling percentages, but also giving you an idea of where I'm modeling them in my actual model this week. And it gives you a good way to just consolidate all of that research, right? You're not going to website after website to try and bring up shots gained metrics. You're not having to bring up each player specifically. All of it is put into an easy to read format to expedite that research process for you. So check it out down below. There is a link in the description of the video to check out my Patreon page. There's a golf DFS tier on there. So if you're just looking for access to these spreadsheets, that's the tier that you guys want to check out. So link is down below. It goes a long way with helping support the channel. And again, gives you easy access to these spreadsheets that I'm putting together, not only for the main slate every single week, but I do these for Showdown, right? Rounds 2 through 4 Showdown. I'm updating them, posting the salaries, giving you guys ownership and a player pool and projections for all of those rounds. So make sure to check it out down below. A really good value if you're just looking for PGA DFS advice. And again, what I think is the best tool when it comes to the industry. But now for our value plays down low, we're going to start with Brian Harman at 7,800. So for me, a value play is anyone $8,000 and below. That essentially is a core play, right? Somebody I'm trying to get well over the field on. And sometimes these value plays will be pieces of chalk that I'm splurging on. And in the case of these 3 players, all 3 of them, they are going to carry some ownership. They are not going to be leverage plays, but they're also guys that in terms of the salary, in terms of the skill set for this golf course, are deficiencies in my opinion. They're players that I think should be more expensive, probably even chalkier than what they're going to come in on a Thursday morning. So for that reason, are guys that I want to get over the field on, be pretty aggressive about with my exposure, but also considering for some outright bets. So let's start with Brian Harman, who is like the perfect course horse here, right? And if we take a look at the last 12 measured rounds, he's been playing pretty solid golf of late. In fact, right, gaining in every category but around the green. And given his elite tier short game, right, maybe the best player when it comes to scrambling on tour, I'm not worried about that whatsoever, right? What I'm much more excited about is the fact that he's gaining ball striking, right? About 0.65 strokes per round, pretty respectable stuff right there. And then with the putter doing his thing, gaining close to a stroke per round right there. And that is Brian Harman golf, right? If we zoom out a little bit, you'll see that it's very consistent, right? Still gaining with the ball striking, very stout with that short game. And at golf courses where you don't have to have power off the tee, where it's much more about that precision, is where Brian Harman is live to win. I mean, you saw that at the Open Championship. That course was actually even a little bit longer than what I usually like for a Brian Harman. But at the RBC Heritage, you literally couldn't set up a golf course better than what we have here for Brian Harman. So the event history has been okay for him. In fact, I would argue that this is a little bit disappointing of course history based on how well he fits this golf course. So it's been 4 or 5 made cuts. That is respectable. It's been 2 top 13 finishes, including a top 7 finish here last year. This T35, this T28, and obviously the missed cut are where I'm getting a little bit disappointed here. But with the course fit, I would expect to see a win over the last 5 years. I would expect to see at least one top 5 finish, and we haven't gotten that. So a little bit surprising that he hasn't had more success, but I'm always going to be team course history, right? Trying to find guys that fit the skill set for any given week. And when I was running my modeling over on Bet the Number, our course breakdown yesterday, Brian Harman showed up in literally every single category. I mean, it was uncanny. There were a few guys that had that. In fact, Tom Hoge, who we're going to talk up here in a few minutes, and same thing with our last value play, are all in that same category. They just showed up time and time again this week. He's a player that puts really well on the POA overseed, extremely accurate off the tee, from 175 to 200, which is that iron range that I'm really honing in on this week. He's a plus player in all those categories. Distance from center of fairway is one of the best players on all the PGA Tour. Course history, decent too. I mean, literally everything over here in our modeling is something that we can check off. So for that reason, is a player that I'm getting well over the field on. I think he might be close to 15% ownership because of his form, because of the fact that, he's exactly what a lot of people are looking for this week. But at 40 to 1, I thought there was some value there. And if I have to play him in a third of my lineups to get leverage, I'm comfortable with that, right? I mean, he was one of my first clicks this week. He was one of the guys that I thought would be $8,500 and pretty chalky. He's $7,800, so even cheaper than where I thought he'd come in. And honestly, if he's sub 20% ownership, I'll still get that leverage out there. So once again, if you're starting with 2 of these chalky guys up top, or let's say that you did start like Xander, you took Shane Lowry, and then Brian Harman is either your 3rd or 4th man in, well, your last few spots are really going to have to get different. So these aren't the sort of leverage plays that you're going to get that, GPP game theory edge, right, that you're looking for with a lot of players. But if you're mixing in somebody like a Tommy Fleetwood, right, slightly lower ownership, maybe you're starting your lineup with Tommy Ladd, then load up on all the Brian Harman you want. In fact, if you wanted to take Brian Harman as a value play, even a pretty chalky Tom Hoge that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, if you're starting with one of your pivots up top, right, you don't have to worry about that leverage as much, right? You maybe have to take 1, maybe 2 pivots with your last few spots, and you're going to be just fine for the largest field contest. So that's what I'll say about Harman, right? You're not going to get a lot of differentiation there, but in terms of course fit, in terms of value compared to salary, is one of the best plays, in my opinion, on the entire slate. Next up, you've got Tom Hoge. Just mentioned that we'd get to him in here just a second. And he's 100 to 1, so he's plus 10,000 when it comes to his odds. In my opinion, just ridiculous stuff. And if you take a look at the shots gained metrics, kind of like Brian Harman is surprisingly playing well, right? Off the tee, maybe not his best stuff. Around the green, maybe not his best stuff lately, but gaining over a stroke per round with the irons. In fact, 1 1/3 strokes per round. Gaining with the flat stick, which isn't always a consistent category for Hoge, but when he's gaining with the flat stick, he brings a ton of upside to the table. And you may say like, oh, it's a small sample size thing, right? He's just really hitting his irons well over the last few events. Not really, right? He's still losing off the tee, still losing around the green. Still gaining with the flat stick, though, over the last 24 rounds and gaining 1.3 strokes approach per round. So this is not the last 12 rounds. This is not even the last 24 rounds. If you look at the last 50 rounds for Tom Hoge, this guy has been absolutely striping it. Maybe the best iron player, the most consistent iron player, not named Scotty Scheffler. So you like that for Tom Hoge. He's only $7,000, so super cheap at this sort of golf course. And kind of like Brian Harman, the event history is not what you'd expect, and it is actually much worse than what we have for Brian Harman. You can see over his last 5 years, he's missed 4 of his last 5 cuts. Now, signature event kind of changes that up a little bit, right? I'm not going to have to worry about that nearly as much, but at $7,000, I think this is a guy who could win the golf tournament, right? So I bet him at 100 to 1 out there for the outright odds. He's got the exact kind of skill set that we're looking for. He's not an off-the-tee specialist. We know that, right? Is consistently going to lose in that category, but is able to set up angles off the tee, is actually a slightly better than average driving accuracy player. And when you look at distance from center of fairway, is also extremely respectable there too. In fact, even better than what he has for his driving accuracy number. So a golf course that off the tee fits his game, right? It's not going to be nearly as much of detriment as what we have for some of the longer golf courses with that rough. The approach play, we know he's going to be always up there in that top 5, an elite tier player in that category. And on the greens here, he's been really good, right? He's gaining over 0.6 strokes per round when it comes to his putting on this POA overseed, which he's been putting well here in 2024, so it's not a huge gap compared to his baseline, but if anything, right, he should be better on this surface than what we have for the others on tour. So recent form ranking is only number 23, right, because he's losing strokes in a few categories, but in terms of my long-term course fit, right, he's number 2 in the field. Just ridiculous next level stuff, a player that brings a lot of value to the table, and at 100 to 1, I think is still live to win this golf tournament. And now for our last value play, last outright that we're going to take, is I got Nick Taylor at 100 to 1, which isn't the best number that you can get. Hard Rock Bet like doesn't post guys at 120. It's either 100 to 1, 125 to 1, 150 to 1. They only do them in really big increments, but still somebody that I bet, because just like Tom Hoge, just like Brian Harman, they showed up on my course breakdown time and time again. Like literally every single category that I'm looking at, he was checking emphatically. And when somebody's doing that, right, I don't care if they're going to be 100 to 150 to 1. I'm going to take that shot on him. So he's a DFS play that I'm getting well over the field on. Just like our other two value plays, I do think he's going to get some ownership. Now, I don't think he'll be 15 to 20%, right? I think something closer to 10% ownership is probably realistic for Nick Taylor. But even there, I'll take my 25, 30% and get well over the field. The main reason for playing him is just like the last two guys, right? He's doing all of the things that we're looking for. So what was his price? What is he? $6,600. It's a little bit cheaper than I was looking at there. You'll see that Nick Taylor is just going off here, gaining a bunch of strokes of the approach play, bunch of strokes with the putter. Has been pretty decent off the tee, but he's not a long player off the tee. It's much more about that precision when it comes to that category than it is overpowering a golf course. So if we zoom out a little bit, just like we had with Tom Hoge, you'll see that this isn't just a recent trend, right? He's still gaining a bunch of strokes on approach. In fact, even better than what you've had over the last 12 measured rounds. And same thing with the flat stick. The only two categories that have been a little bit inconsistent for him have been the off the tee play, which I'm not that worried about at this golf course. Again, it's not a huge detriment out there in that category. And then around the green, he can be a little bit inconsistent, but he's far from a poor player in that category. And when you add that all up with at least an okay course history out there with Nick Taylor, he's the sort of player that I'll get over the field on. So last year, finished T41. That's not amazing, right? T58 last year when it was a cut event back there 5 years ago, a couple missed cuts. So maybe this keeps the ownership a little bit lower than it should be, but it's not the worst course history that I've ever seen, right? You take a look at the shots gained profile for Taylor. He's still been pretty good with that putter and the putting around this golf course. Just has to do a better job of avoiding the big numbers. So at $6,600 is super cheap. If you're trying to take a double spend up like a Xander and a Tommy Fleetwood together, he gives you a little bit of flexibility to do so. The only real issue, and it's really the only issue with like 5 of our plays here, is ownership, right? I think because of the form, because of the course fit, that they're not going to be completely overlooked. But that also means that I'm not going to fade all of them, right? They're the plays that just were funneling towards the top of all my analysis, and I'll find other spots to get different. So, of course, guys, part of the Patreon page is getting to see my entire player pool. If you want to see the guys that I'm taking at lower ownership as a few stabs, that's where you can go out there and do that. So on Wednesday, we'll be talking through some of the pivots, going through some highlighted plays that you can get to for lower ownership. But just know, because these guys are all chalky, does not mean all my lineups are going to be starting with these 6 players. In fact, if I'm building my lineups, I probably want at most 3 of these players, right? Because if I'm starting with like a Xander, Shane Lowry is pretty chalky too, right? As one of my guys in the 8K range, and then I'm throwing in Tom Hoge at $7,000. That's a pretty high product ownership right there. So for my last 3 spots, I'm going to have to find players that are lower owned. So obviously, right, I go through some of the plays on here to give you an idea of my exposure, but it's much more about how you're putting these lineups together than the actual players that you're taking. So if there's anything to take away from this video, it is first off the lineup construction that we just mentioned, but also, right, the skill set that I'm looking for. Because when we get to Wednesday, right, there are going to be some guys that are, maybe not the best off the tee, but are really good approach players, especially from 175 to 200, and are solid putters on the surface that are overlooked, right? Maybe they don't have as good a form as the guys that we saw, right? Maybe they're not gaining like 3/4 of a stroke per round in those 2 categories like we have with Nick Taylor, but maybe they're a third of a stroke, maybe a half a stroke gained per round in each category. And rather than being 15, 20%, you could find them at 10 to maybe 10.5% ownership, something like that. So I'm going to be looking for those plays. Anything sub 15% that fits this golf course is going to be a player that I'm looking to get leverage to. So that's it for the DFS and betting side and some of the players that I'm considering for this week. Alrighty guys, that is all I've got for my DFS and betting preview this week. Before you hop on out of here, go ahead and smash that like button for me, and also comment down below who you've got as your winner for this golf tournament. No giveaway on that side. The giveaway is going to be for the winning score this week, so make sure to hop over to the course breakdown video. Give me guys your winning score prediction if you guys want to enter for a free chance to earn a month on my Patreon page. But best of luck this week with all the exposure that you're getting to. Again, very curious who you guys are taking for your outright bet, and let's go out there and have ourselves a week. Of course, as I mentioned, the Wednesday live stream will be at 7 p.m. Eastern time, going over all your questions down there in the live chat. So make sure to stop on by there for all of your weather takes, all of your GPP ownership thoughts, any questions that you've got down there in chat. We'll also talk props over there in Underdog and Prize Picks and get you guys ready for all of your exposure for this signature event. I'm looking forward to it. Should be an absolute blast. Again, appreciate all the support here on the channel. Give me that comment with your top player this week, your top outright bet. Smash the like button, and I'll see you guys for that live stream on Wednesday.